We had a failed violent insurrection effort in January. Biden was inaugurated. We've got a bunch of months since. And when I knew we were going to be within an hour of each other, I asked for this interview, and you said sure. So I'd love to let you have the platform to say what you would like, what messaging you'd like to say. I mean, I read that wonderful piece you wrote about 50 years from Hiroshima and Nagasaki and connecting it to the pandemic.
Well, one way to start, there are so many directions here, but one way to start is the emphasis I've been giving in recent work, not only on the psychology of the survivor in general, which I've always been interested in,
Yep.
ever since I wrote about that in great detail toward the end of my book on Hiroshima, and wrote about it in general terms. My present interest in the survivor is in terms of the his or her importance for renewal. And there's a parallel here with cults, and it's very much in your own personal history. If one survives a cult and has then the means and the structure and the capacity to look at what one has survived, one can be in the forefront of renewal in struggles against totalism or cultism. And the same is true for more general survivor possibilities. For instance, in the piece I sent you and in recent work in general, I'm very struck by the fact that the Trumpists and the rightists, and there are different groups, he didn't create them all, but he certainly has mobilized them, deny, or more accurately reject, the pandemic as an overall catastrophe. They sometimes recognize it, sometimes deny it, they're often contradictory, but it never takes the shape in their minds for what it really is, a major world-threatening catastrophe. If you reject the idea of catastrophe, then you can't be a survivor of that catastrophe. And you're caught in it, and you're likely to oppose others as they seek to survive the capacity and do the psychological work that can overcome it. For instance, the new administration, the Biden administration, did something very profound and admirable when the night before it took office, it had this large event of mourning, which was a collective event, and it can't reach everyone and it can't do everything, but it did do a great deal to recognize the pain of an overall, all-enveloping catastrophe and the value of mourning, collective mourning, in overcoming it. And more than overcoming it, the value of survivors overcoming that catastrophe in the service of renewal of society. And that's now going on. That's one way of looking psychologically at the struggle that's going on in our society. So anyhow, that's a beginning for what we may talk about. The other thing which we can get into is that when the true catastrophe is rejected, they can't deny it completely. It's too organic and it kills people. And they get it. They get ill. But they can reject it. Simply ignore it, contest the scientific truths, as they do regularly, and block in any way, in any destructive way they can, any reasonable approach toward it. When you partly deny it and partly reject it in this way, you're likely to imagine catastrophes of your own, imagined and false ones, like the genocide of the white race. I mean, they didn't create that catastrophe, that collective fantasy, but they embraced it. And at the heart of Trumpist support is that kind of white supremacy idea. So you then create alternative catastrophes of a false kind.
Right.
Or
and project it on your enemies.
Yes, exactly. And in that way, and also the replacement idea, the Jews are replacing true Americans, namely themselves, and then they become perverse survivors of catastrophes that have only been imagined, but imagined with fierce and violent potential. So that's the kind of beginning I would make.
Yeah, definitely. The phobias, the irrational fears that are drummed up in cult members, directed to an enemy that they can all rally against, this big enemy.
Yeah.
And this very binary, black and white, all or nothing, simplistic, almost childlike formulation of reality, ignoring complexity or subtlety.
This is, you mean, the right wing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or any cult, any authoritarian.
Yes. And the right wing opposition, and in a sense they've stunned everyone because they've gone further in criminality and in treasonous activities in terms of American security than anyone imagined they would. And even those who individually wouldn't be in favor of necessarily of all these treasonous and destructive and criminal activities, nonetheless go along with them or embrace them because they're part of a movement. And when we talk about the cult-like elements in the Trumpist movement, it's both cultist in general, as you and I know, but it also has the remnants of a political party. The political party is no longer functioning as a political party, but it's still, you still have people often in rural areas and in different parts of the country who are used to voting Republican and embracing Republican ideas and still do that without their necessarily embracing the extremities, the extreme ideas of Trump and white supremacists. So, and of course, there is the obvious, but it has to be said, the great mystery, and I'm not sure anyone has a complete answer to it, of how so much of the country could come to believe in the big lie, particularly about the election. It's the key to the false catastrophe. In a sense, for the Trumpists, the catastrophe is the election and the claim that Biden won it.
That Trump won it. That's
because Trump
claim.
really won it.
Right.
Trump really won it, and the catastrophe is stealing it from him.
Right. That's the reframe.
That's the reframing, and it's a staggering idea, as many have said, and as we have to keep reminding ourselves, that so much of the country could believe in this big lie. And there, of course, the social media play a very large part.
Huge.
Yeah, a huge part. And those of us who have been, for so long, struggling with people's attraction to falsehoods and people's susceptibility to totalism, cultic and political and combinations of them, have to face this fact, and it's a new dimension of danger and problem. It's a new level of problem for those of us who have been concerned with these issues.
Yes, exactly. So I may like to prod you a little bit, if I may. You, way back when I got deprogrammed from the Moonies, I started reading all of your books, and I read The Protean Man, and I think that those insights into the flexibility, adaptability of people, identity, to recreate themselves and adapt it. Say a few words about those thoughts. I'm then going to ask you about the Nazi doctors, then I'm going to ask you about Om Shinrikyo.
Okay. Yes, I've had a renewed, it may sound self-serving to talk of renewed interest in one's own work, but I draw upon my work because it has relevance for the present, and I've been very focused on what I call Proteinism. Now, Proteinism, as you know, as I define it, it's named after the Greek sea god Proteus, who was a notorious shapeshifter.
Right.
And it has the possibility of transformation, change, multiplicity, and the avoidance of being stuck in an absolute. And in that sense, it's an antagonist to totalism. But it's not so simple. And, you know, I might have told you this incident, but I was given a certain wisdom by an incident I had years and years ago, in the 70s, when I went to a large reception. It happened to be at the City University long before I went there to work. A kind of aggressive graduate student kind of pulled up to me and said, "Hey, Lifton," he said, "I tried being a Protean man and it doesn't work."
I love it.
And I didn't know quite what to say to him. I said, well, I wasn't prescribing Proteinism as a tendency. I said things that were true, but were totally inadequate to what he was raising. And he was raising something very serious. You couldn't constantly change. You needed some stability. So I've been working and wrote a piece on grounded Proteinism. I'll send it to you. It's being published in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association.
Great.
I think this coming year.
Great.
I'll send it to you. And grounded Proteinism seeks to combine that changeability and multiplicity and capacity for adaptation, which Proteinism at its best can express, seeks to combine that with sufficient stability. Now, one might naturally think either you're stable or you're Protean and you're changing, but that's not the truth. You need an element of stability, what I call grounded Proteinism, for the Proteinism to work. You know, in the piece I take up some of the great psychoanalytic teachers, for instance, Freud and Jung would each late at night create and pour out these wild thoughts. Freud about the sexual origin of the neurosis, and Jung in his tower in Switzerland about the incredible possibilities of the mind, including psychosis. But they met their patients in the morning. They were actually dedicated therapists who cared about their patients. And Jung wrote about this and said, my work, my standing as a psychiatrist, my commitment to mental sciences are the rock on which I stand. In other words, and Freud too was dedicated to his work, was in touch with, although much has been said about his vaunted isolation, and he was isolated in some degree, he was also in touch with all kinds of going groups and had a lot of people were interested in him even when they were attacking him. So he was also dedicated to his work, was kept on with his sessions every single day, and that was the center, a great center.
Oops, you're getting a call. That's yours.
Oh, that.
Forgot to tell you to turn off your...
My own daughter, but I'll call her back.
You may want to do not disturb.
Yeah.
Back to Freud and dedicated to
so,
students.
So
to clients.
there always has been the need for, I mean, it doesn't have to be solely in one's work, it can be in one's family life, it can be, but also there's even a psychobiological element of Proteinism that can be a source of stability. Proteinism is based on our capacity for symbolization. And I mean, as I say in my work, not just one thing symbolizing another. Say in traditional psychoanalysis, pen equals penis, or ocean equals vagina, or some such.
Right.
It's rather that every time we take in some kind of perception, in order to take it in, we have to recreate it. Because we have this gray matter that insists on its action in relation to our experience. So with that kind of recreation, which is psychobiological, there is the possibility for Proteinism and change in the process of the recreation. And in that way, there's a potential for Proteinism. And Proteinism is also stimulated by historical change and historical dislocation. So there's a strong historical element. And then there are the individual psychological elements that I began to touch on, that one may have, in which one may have areas of stability. So in that way, when it's not enough, and this is what you're saying in a way by inviting me to talk about Proteinism, it's not enough just to identify totalism, though we have to do that. It's useful to look at patterns of the mind that can be an alternative to totalism. And that's how I return to Proteinism, and particularly to grounded Proteinism.
If I may also ask you to talk about symbolic immortality and connect with the nuclear bomb and how it transformed human experience.
Even when I studied people in Hiroshima, interviewed survivors of the bomb in Hiroshima.
And it's 50 years, correct, since that
1962. It's
horror.
amazing. It's more than 50 years.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yes, these time spans are staggering, but I've learned to live with them.
Yes.
They were concerned, of course, with resuming their lives and their family lives, if they could, under a lot of duress and residual death anxiety relating to radiation. But they were also concerned with sustaining human attachment, the flow of generations. It's one reason why the bomb was so threatening and even could do harm to future generations. And it was not, it was radiation that was feasible with radiation.
Right.
And it's still
A threat.
a threat and an unclear issue. So in that connection or determination to still relate to the flow of generations, I saw that, as I had in previous work on other things, as a form of symbolic immortality. I think that all of us live on two levels. We live on the immediate interaction with lots of psychological issues that have to do, as Freud said, primarily with work and love, and with everything in between. But we also live on a level of what Paul Tillich, the theologian, called ultimate concern, something that really we deeply care about, and that we want to be part of, and that's larger than the self.
Yep.
That can relate to family and children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren,
Future
over the generations,
generations.
so that the biological becomes biosocial, psychological. It can relate to religious ideas, though one needn't be what we call a religious person to require this sense of symbolic immortality, because I think that's with us, and it's, again, part of our mental equipment, because we are the species, the human species, who knows that we die. We seek a means of living with that knowledge. If we literalize it and imagine that we can live forever, then I think that gets us into trouble. But if we recognize ourselves as part of the flow of generations, that enhances our capacity for adaptation and for even forms of Proteinism that can help. And even in what seem like rather modest ways, the influence we have, let's say, on our students or our patients, it has to do with the flow of human influence on subsequent generations, and we feel related to something larger than ourselves. So symbolic immortality, you know, Freud said any mention of immortality is denial of death. Well, that's an oversimplification. It's denial of death when you think you can live forever, or you don't think there's anything such as death. But to be part of the flow of generations, and to require symbolic immortality in that way is to be human.
Right. But my recollection of your books said that with the advent of the nuclear bomb, we could imagine total annihilation of everything on Earth and the only thing left was Transcendence,
Well,
if I remember correctly.
that's close to it, yes. What I said about nuclear weapons is they threaten every mode of symbolic immortality. The biological mode, who's going to be left? The mode of human influence or creative mode, even the idea of some religious belief in a life after death is threatened. And the quest for transcendence is a special mode. These are high states, and in high states we can feel ourselves to be part of something larger than ourselves. Sometimes some people achieve that with drugs or medications, some with a sense of beauty. It can be present in sexual behavior and in intense experience of any kind. In a way, with nuclear threat, but with other potentially world-ending threats, including the pandemic and certainly including climate threat, there becomes a greater need for this kind of experience of transcendence, but still uncertainty about our future. And now, when we face what is rather a new, potentially world-ending threat, that of the pandemic, our imagery of nuclear destruction enters into it. It's the basic, we came to, ever since the beginning of the nuclear age, we came to view nuclear weapons as potentially the ultimate source of world-ending destruction.
Right.
And so that feeling can be then associated with the pandemic and also with climate change, as I wrote about in my book called The Climate Swerve. So yes, the world, those threats that are apocalyptic in their very nature, nuclear, climate, and now the pandemic, have in common that idea of leaving us without any clear sense of symbolic immortality, or at least with that symbolic immortality threatened. So what do you and I do, and lots of other people who are thoughtful and energetic? They struggle with this, and they keep on bringing forth efforts at renewal, which often come from survival, and in that way seek to sustain in combating these world-ending threats a measure of symbolic immortality.
Yeah, that's great. Are you okay? Can we do a little bit more?
A little bit more, yeah.
Okay, about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, okay.
So I'd like you to comment on your Nazi doctor's study and doubling, and then I'd like you to connect the dots with Shinrikyo, a conspiracy theory cult that did sarin gassing on its own citizens and had all of these crazy hallucinogenic, initiations. And
Well, to start with the Nazi doctors, I'll talk only about doubling for a moment.
Great.
And then relate the doubling to the other issues
Great.
you mentioned. When I studied Nazi doctors, I found, for instance, that they could spend their days doing selections and selecting Jews for the gas chamber. They could go home on weekends to Germany, or on their version of R&R, week-long visits with their families, and seem to be ordinary fathers and husbands. Of course, it wasn't completely, but they had certain defenses that enabled them
Right.
to continue to be ordinary fathers and husbands for the most part, while killing people as their day job,
Right.
so to speak,
And torturing them too.
and torturing them. And I came to the idea of doubling, which really amounts to it's a form of division, or inner division of the self, and it's been talked about, or other things close to it, splitting has been talked about in a lot of psychoanalytic literature, but it's a way of creating what is functionally a second self,
Yeah.
which is at odds morally with one's primary.
Yeah, that was my experience in the Moonies. I had two selves.
Yes, well, that happens with cults, exactly.
Yeah.
In cults, then, one takes on a cultic self with the whole totalistic control and with its elements of belief that become literalized. And yet, people could come out as you did, and sometimes rather quickly. Sometimes, as you have and others have noticed, even when there are cases against the cult, legal cases, just to walk over to one's family's table and lawyers somewhat reactivated the prior self.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In other words, there's a kind of doubling,
Yes, exactly.
which is a widespread tendency. It's not limited to Nazi doctors.
Right.
I mean, you can find it in mafia leaders who become pillars of their community and support all the good, causes.
Yeah.
But in any case, with cults, there can be these functional two selves,
Yeah.
but it is the same self.
Yeah.
And that's problematic because there can be a lot of evil carried out through doubling, which is a defense mechanism that enables one to participate in evil and be otherwise a relatively ordinary person.
Yeah.
You don't have to be born with evil or the sign of Cain.
Yeah,
as far as
I see it as like mind hacking and a virus being put inside my head when I was in the cult, or other people, where we're now in the image of the cult leader or in the image of the ideology instead of our own grounded self.
Yes, exactly.
And that when my traumatic deprogramming happened, they like reverted.
Yes.
Back to Steve.
You personally in your own life have illustrated this so well and done so much which is initially related to that cultic experience and then uses it to deepen your perspective and not only combat the cultic experience but take further the whole idea of influence on the mind.
Right.
And that's an admirable process.
Thank you. It's been a journey, and I have to thank you yet again, because it was you who inspired a very depressed, ashamed, embarrassed young college dropout with a cast on his leg, and you said, you actually know more than I know because you've lived it.
Right.
They did it to you, you did it to other people, and what you described is more sophisticated than what I studied. Study psychology, and it was really that reframe of my experience.
You could begin to see yourself being active.
And make lemonade out of lemons, really.
Yeah.
But before we finish, I'd like you to talk about this multi-billion-dollar cult in Japan that recruited military, police, had the youngest lawyer, they had a $2 billion computer company, Shinrikyo, whose leader, Shoko Asahara, claimed to be Buddha and Jesus, who claimed that the CIA and the Freemasons, blah, 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 and, terrorized Japan. And how it relates to today.
Well, there are many things to say about Om Shinrikyo. One thing is that there has never been a more apocalyptic cult. It was completely built upon apocalypticism, and Asahara didn't hesitate to make use of Christian, Buddhist,
Right.
any kind of apocalypticism that could bring about world destruction. And what was, of course, notable about him was that he took an active stance toward world destruction.
Yeah.
That phrase that was used in ancient rabbinical experience as forcing the end. I wrote about this, and perhaps you know about it. There was this dispute among rabbis in ancient times about the coming of the Messiah,
Yeah.
because it was known that there would be violence with the coming of the Messiah. So was it a good idea to join in that violence that would enhance the coming of the Messiah? And to their wisdom, the rabbis decided no, let God take over the timing.
Oh, okay.
So, but with Asahara, it was the idea of forcing the end, of enhancing and speeding up the appearance of the Messiah by becoming violent, and he came to view, however psychotically, this still, I mean, it was a large cult, but it was still small among, let's say, armies,
Right.
as itself an army, and worked on building weapons of mass destruction.
Yep.
And he did make some crude, his group made some crude biological and chemical weapons, and tried very hard, unsuccessfully, fortunately, to make nuclear weapons. So he literalized his apocalypticism. And just to say a word about apocalypticism, it's a really interesting and important issue, and not easy to deal with, because once you relate strongly to an apocalyptic vision, you're giving great significance to your death.
Yeah.
And it can be a wholly purifying commitment that you're taking. Of course, it can then be literalized with world destruction. I was, again, I mentioned Tillich before. I happened to know him and to be able to talk to him about some of these things. And he said that the learned Christian teachers talked about apocalypticism in its symbolic form, but that some of the teaching for the of the less learned and the more uneducated could take on the literalization of the apocalyptic and of Christianity in general. And the same, of course, for prior to Christianity, the Judaic aspects of apocalypticism. So apocalypticism is still very much with us and very dangerous, and we need to recognize it, because wherever it's present and moves toward the literal, it can bring about large destruction and killing, and it can take that form of forcing the end.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the support for Trump come from these New Apostolic Reformation groups, where the leader says they're a prophet, they get direct revelation, and they cast out demons, they claim, and do faith healings, and they are cults in my professional evaluation. So they're just following who they think is connected to God.
So you think that a lot of cults are now politically following Trump?
Yeah, that's the thesis of the cult of Trump, that it's comprised of a lot of authoritarian cults that came together for common good, for their common ends, whether it's to promote global climate crisis as an invention or a hoax, because they have fossil fuels,
Yeah.
or because they're neo-Nazis and they believe in white power,
Of
or
course. Yes.
you know you know, some of the Jewish fanaticism that wanted to oppose Palestinian rights and human rights of
Yes.
Jews that aren't ultra-Orthodox who want to be counted.
I agree, but I would make one modification.
Please.
And say that I emphasize the interaction of the political and the psychological, so that sometimes a political move can have positive psychological tendencies, such as the Biden administration's large ceremony of mourning just before taking
Yeah.
office. And sometimes psychological attitudes can contribute to political attitudes. So there is the cultism and the joining of cultism, and I think we came together in your book and in my book also, Losing Reality. But at the same time, there's a highly political process which is manipulated and interacts either destructively or sometimes constructively with the psychological, and I think we need to pay attention to that interaction.
Yes, exactly. And, nation states are using psychological manipulation techniques through the internet, through social media,
Yeah,
through
of course.
collecting our personal data. And that's where it's so different and more dangerous.
Lots of it, yeah.
Lots of that. So we're wrapping up. Can I ask you how old you are?
Only 95.
95.
I had
God
my-
bless you.
I had I celebrated my 95th birthday in May in a nice and pleasant, quiet celebration.
Wonderful, wonderful. I hope you have many more years of. I wish my brain is as clear as yours, and and able to be as articulate as you are. And if I can be 95, I'd be very happy and grateful
Thank you, Steve.
for that. Any last thing before I turn off the
Well,
recorder?
the last thing I would say is that these are really, we live in a strange combination of doomsday. There's a lot of that around.
Yeah.
And even people like ourselves are not immune from worrying about doomsday. But there are elements of hope in this overall struggle for renewal, and there are barriers everywhere that I won't go into. But I think we should recognize the elements of hope and enter into them in our lives and our work.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'll come back to our very beginning and your comments about survivors and renewal. And I'll tell you that I'm part of a group that is doing a hashtag I Got Out effort to encourage people to share their stories
Yeah.
of having been in an authoritarian group or relationship and we got out,
That's
to try to stimulate and model that it's not a shameful thing if you were in the cult of Trump and believed the crazy QAnon stuff or whatever.
yeah,
Hey,
Well,
we
that's-
believed crazy stuff too. There's life after cult.
yeah. Well said.
Yeah. So thank you very much for everything, and I hope I hope to see you again soon.
I hope so.
Thanks
and
for all your good work.
I've enjoyed, as always, talking to you and being with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.